I'd like to say thank you to Rob Francis and Juliet Willits for organising this forum and inviting me to speak. I do actually enjoy this open town hall meetings that gets us out of Canberra and talk to some real people for a change. What I'm going to try to do today is probably talk a little bit between what Minar's been talking about in terms of the global aid effectiveness agenda, and I think what Paul and Juliet will be speaking about later around more specific approaches to monitoring and evaluation, and talk about the role of what it means in a bilateral donor. So very quickly, what I'll do is basically three things. One is to give you a very, very quick overview of the Australian aid program and also the Office of Development Effectiveness and what its role is. Secondly, to give you an idea of how we actually seek to assess our effectiveness and what we can say in the broad about the effectiveness of the Australian aid program. And thirdly, just touch on some future challenges. As most of you know, AusAid is the Australian Government's official development agency. We implement about 85% of the official development assistance program. About 15% is implemented by other agencies. We're headquartered in Canberra but have an increasing amount of our people in the field in offices where our programs are being delivered. The Office of Development Effectiveness is a freestanding unit within AusAid. I think it's a bit rich to call us independent. We are part of AusAid, but we are separate from program management. So we have a degree of independence, but I think I'd be telling you a fib if I told you we were truly independent of AusAid. And there's a reason, if people want to ask a question, why we decided to set up this way. And as Mary mentioned, we were established in 2006 and we're set up to monitor the quality and assess the impact of the Australian aid program. I report directly to the head of AusAid and also to a senior level cross-government development effectiveness steering committee with the deputy heads of the Treasury, Finance Department, Prime Minister's Department and our Foreign Affairs Department. But we have a fairly free remit to assess effectiveness and conduct evaluations and generally make ourselves a bit of a nuisance to program areas who are busy trying to implement the program. We have a flagship publication which is called the Annual Review of Development Effectiveness. The very first one of these was tabled in Parliament in March in 2008 and we're expecting the second one to be tabled in Parliament shortly. I have to say too that we're only one of two bilateral donors who produce a regular report on effectiveness, and I think the government should be congratulated for taking that step because it is not an easy thing for a government to air its dirty laundry, such as it may be, and publicly in that. In terms of an overview of the aid program, I mean, most people might realise that the objective of the Australian aid program is to reduce poverty and promote sustainable development in line with Australia's national interest. The total budget this year is $3.7 billion, or 3.32% of gross national income, a little bit up from Minar's graph, and it's up from $3.2 billion in 2007-08. In terms of the geographic focus, we're heavily concentrated in the Asia-Pacific. That's our backyard, that's what we know, and I think that's where our interests lie too more broadly. Indonesia is now the largest recipient of Australian aid, overtaking the long-time leader Papua New Guinea 2 years ago, with about $462 million programmed annually. PNG is still the second at about $390 million a year. Solomon Islands, $238 million, and Africa at $116 million. I think an interesting way to look at the program too is to look at how the influence, the potential influence of the Australian aid program, because in a sense we've got two distinct programs. One is, and this graph, which you can see on the left-hand side, is basically the total aid as a percentage of central government expenditure in recipient countries, and the bottom line being the percentage of Australian aid as a total of all donor aid. And you can see in that bottom left-hand little quadrant are the big Asian economies where aid as a proportion of total government expenditure is quite small, and where Australia's total of that aid thing is, it varies, but it's also small. And outside that small left-hand quadrant are mainly the Pacific Island states where aid does represent a very large part of government expenditure and where Australia is usually the dominant donor. So within those figures, there's quite a different story to tell. I think, as many of you would intuitively know, but thought it'd be useful to show you that graph. In terms of the sectoral allocation of Australian aid, governance is the largest sector. I mean, governance is a very broad remit. It's law and order, it's economic management, it's public sector reform, it's civil society, everything else. But under the previous government, that increased quite substantially. This current government is now looking to reduce governance as a proportion of the program, and you'll see some recent increases in some of the service delivery sectors, education, health and infrastructure. Again, reflecting the focus of this new government. And this new government, of course, has made a number of important policy pronouncements since it came into power. The first is a commitment to reach 0.05% of GNI by 2015, further advancing us up on Minar's graph. And this has been reaffirmed in recent statements by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, and I think that's really important given the current environment that both the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister has reaffirmed that commitment. They've re-emphasised the importance of the MDGs, of poverty reduction, of people-centred development, health, education, water supply and sanitation, disability and climate change. They still have a very strong Asia-Pacific focus, but they're also keen to re-engage with Africa. But they've also said they just don't want just a bigger aid program, they want a better aid program. And I think, as we'll see, increased scrutiny of the results of the aid program as volumes increase, and particularly as pressures mount on other domestic portfolios because of the global financial crisis. So how effective is Australian aid? It's spurious and in fact very difficult to give a yes or no answer to that question. There's some 2,000 activities that are currently operating under the program across more than 20 countries. Some interesting characteristics about the Australian aid program: half of our country or bilateral spend are to countries that are classified by the World Bank as fragile states. Now, fragile states are basically countries that are unable or unwilling to provide services to their people, and we know from international experiences that results in these states is much more difficult to achieve than in well-functioning states.